I want to preface this video essay with the disclaimer that this is solely my interpretation and analysis of the problem of evil as it is presented in F.ScottFitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and doesn't represent my opinion on the problem of evil. I would also like to preface that the formatting of this video is heavily inspired by and follows the editing patterns of my favorite video essayist, Wendigoon. With prefaces out of the way, here is my interpretation of the problem of evil in the works of The Great Gatsby and Blood Meridian. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? David Hume. Throughout the stories of both The Great Gatsby as well as Blood Meridian, the problem of evil is confronted in a plurality of ways which force the reader to confront the problem of evil and ask the question, how can an omnipotent and benevolent God allow for evil to exist? The problem of evil within The Great Gatsby is most present within the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg, which act as an allegory for the eyes of God. In Blood Meridian, the problem of evil is most present through the character of Judge Holden, who acts as an allegory for the unwavering evil of man, as well as a malevolent God. It is through this rhetoric of evocation of the problem of evil, as well as other forms of rhetoric that F.ScottFitzgerald and Cormac McCarthy use to ascribe their opinions on the immorality and the problem of evil they believe present throughout the world, as well as prompt the reader to consider their sentiments on the problem of evil as well. Within The Great Gatsby, the first instance of the problem of evil is brought up during the rising action of the novel in Chapter 2. The scene follows the protagonist Nick as he follows Tom on a train to reach the grand forsaken Valley of Ashes, which Nick importantly notes as having the pushed-out-of-sight billboard of T.J. Eckleburg overlooking it. The scene then follows Nick as he bears witness to Tom disrespecting Wilson, a man who lives there. Nick then follows Tom as he invites Myrtle, Wilson's wife, to an apartment to throw a party with the intent for both to cheat on their spouses. Nick continues to follow Tom with his only objection to being towards attending the party himself, which Tom responds by asserting himself over Nick, convincing him to stay. The final parts of the scene witness Nick attending the party and after a while leaving after he had witnessed Tom assault Myrtle as a result of Myrtle repeating the name Daisy, Tom's wife. One of the first forms of rhetoric described within this scene is Nick's use of negative imagery to describe the Valley of Ashes as being a place desolate and grotesquely ashen with literal ash covering everything, and men having to exert themselves to extremes to live there. This disgusting imagery is used not only to critique the effects that the American dream has on others, forcing confrontation with the reader's concept of the American dream and the moral decay it results in, but also serves to set the stage for the introduction of the problem of evil. The problem of evil is first introduced within The Great Gatsby through one of the most important and prominent symbols within the novel, that being the billboard of T.J. Eckleburg. Nick characterizes the billboard as having eyes that are blue and gigantic, their retinas 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non-existent nose. Nick then further characterizes the eyes as dimmed a little by paintless days under the sun and rain. The characterization of T.J. Eckleburg has multiple underlying meanings that are intentionally set to be open to interpretation. However, it can be assumed from the intentional parallel of the decaying eyes of T.J. Eckleburg to the decaying morals of the Valley of Ashes that one of the underlying meanings about the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg is that they are the eyes of God, overlooking a morally decaying society. This assumption is further proven through Nick's ironic description of the real oculist who placed the billboard there as a wag of an oculist who then sank himself down into eternal blindness or forgot them and moved away. This juxtaposition of an oculist who either sank himself down into blindness or forgot furthers the idea that T.J. Eckleburg is allegorical for a God who has either chosen not to help a crumbling society or has unintentionally not been able to, which parallels the problem of evil. This presence can easily be seen through Nick's description of the only picture in Myrtle's apartment as appearing as a hen on a rock up close, but when farther away, becoming a bonnet on a stout old woman. This evocation of perspective serves the surface-level purpose of thematically approaching the difference in perspective among people who experience lives distantly different from one another, thus provoking the reader into a confrontation of their perspective, but also serves the much deeper meaning and similar purpose of encouraging a personal interpretation of symbolism used within the work. Within the Blood Meridian, the first time the problem of evil is brought up within the book is in the 12th chapter during the rising action of the book. This chapter follows the kid shortly after he joined the Glanton gang. During this chapter, the Glanton gang spends about 3 weeks searching for Apaches to scalp and then sell their scalps. The book shows conversations between members of the gang attempting to impose their ideals on each other at night. The ex-priest and the judge are the primary speakers during these conversations. The chapter ends with the Glanton gang returning to Chihuahua City, where they are welcomed as saviors. Of the many evils that occur within this chapter, let alone this book, one of the notable evils that prompts a philosophical debate among the Glanton gang is the scene of a recent battle that was described as 5 wagons smoldered on the desert floor, and the riders dismounted and moved among the bodies of the dead Argonauts in silence. Those right pilgrims, nameless among the stones with their terrible wounds, the viscera spilled from their sides, and the naked torsos blistered with arrow shafts. The scene's grim description is meant to challenge the reader with the harsh and evil world around them. This makes the reader then confront the world around them to see the evil that they witness. This scene also serves as an introduction to the philosophy of Tobin. The first direct mention of the problem of evil occurs when Tobin, the ex-priest, rhetorically ponders, if some might not see the hand of a cynical God conducting with what sternness and what mock surprise so lethal a congruence. This statement, specifically from a man who used to be a priest, uses the man's religious authority as a way for McCarthy to make a statement on how the vile circumstances of the world lead men to question the God they once believed benevolent. This serves as a way for McCarthy to force the reader to confront the question of how a benevolent God could be when evil occurs. McCarthy further brings into question the existence of a just and benevolent God when the scene describes the welcome the Glanton gang receives after scalping the Apache and returning to Chihuahua City. The scene is described as, on the 21st night of July, in the year of 1849, the Glanton gang rode into Chihuahua City and received a hero's welcome. Then described the town with small boys who ran among the hooves of the Glanton gang in their gory rags, smiled through the filth of the dust and the caked blood as they bore on poles the desiccated heads of the enemy through that fantasy of music and flowers. This scene serves as McCarthy confronting the reader with the fact that many times, though people commit vile actions, they are seen as heroes and rewarded for their actions. This prompts the reader to question how appalling things can be rewarded when there is a just and benevolent God. The second instance of the problem of evil within The Great Gatsby occurs during the climax in Chapter 7. This scene follows Nick as he visits Tom's house where he finds Tom, Gatsby, Daisy, and Jordan. Throughout the scene, Tom begins to suspect that Daisy has feelings towards Gatsby. Tom chooses to try and initiate a sort of argument with Gatsby, as he suggests they visit New York. Importantly, in the events of the book, the characters drive in separate vehicles and happen to stop by Wilson's, where they find out Wilson knows his wife cheated on him. The scene then describes how the sign of T.J. Eckleberg looks on at Wilson and Tom, while Nick notices the similarity of their situation. The rest of the scene follows Tom becoming increasingly aggressive towards Gatsby, to the point where, after harshly questioning Gatsby, everyone leaves. The final part of this scene describes how Nick bears witness to a scene of Myrtle being hit and Tom convincing Wilson that it was Gatsby who hit Myrtle. Throughout the second scene of The Great Gatsby, the importance of perception is continuously brought up. In this scene, the presence of perception can best be seen in Tom when he begins to suspect Daisy and Gatsby's affair. This is most apparent when it is said, "She had told him that she loved him," and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded, his mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby, and then he looked back at Daisy, as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. This scene serves to juxtapose Tom's disgust with the knowledge of Daisy's affair with the fact Tom himself is having an affair. This serves to illustrate the flawed perception of those around Nick by detailing the hypocrisy of Tom. This intends to force the reader to confront the hypocrisy of their views, especially when thinking about the problem of evil. The problem of evil is further alluded to within the scene when over the ash heaps the giant eyes of T.J. Eckleberg kept their vigil, but Nick perceived, after a moment, that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity. The scene then goes on to describe, in one of the windows over the garage, the curtains moved aside a little, and Myrtle Wilson was peering down at the car. This scene's description of the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg continuously harps back to the idea that a god is overlooking the immorality of what's occurring, but is not acting. This part of the scene also plays an extremely important role in contributing to the idea that Fitzgerald hopes for the reader to interpret the symbolism within the book in multiple different ways. This is primarily done by paralleling Myrtle with the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg, while they both overlook the scene below them. This implies that the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg are not only or not even the eyes of God, but instead the eyes of the people around us. One of the final and more important pieces of rhetoric in this scene comes from the death of Myrtle Wilson, which is described as her life violently extinguished, knelt in the road, and mingled her thick dark blood with the dust. Myrtle dying in this same spot that T.J. Eckelberg overlooks, and similarly she overlooked earlier, serves to demonstrate how horrid things occur despite the belief that a god watches over things. This pushes the problem of evil to an extreme and forces the reader's continued meeting with the question of how evil exists despite the belief a benevolent god exists. The second scene of the Blood Meridian, which has a strong connection with the problem of evil, is in chapter 15 during the very start of the climax of the book. This scene starts with the Glanton gang genociding a village for scalps. The scene then follows as multiple members of the Glanton gang are killed, and members of the gang are forced to draw arrows to decide who kills the members who can't ride on. Importantly, the kid is placed in charge of killing a Mexican man, but decides not to, instead letting the man die of his injuries. The kid later sees a pillar of smoke and moves to find it, discovering a burning bush, which he decides to sleep by. The kid then reunites with the remaining members of the Glanton gang, who are all wary of the judge. The gang then rests, and when they wake, they ride all day towards the town of Santa Cruz, where they are greeted harshly but allowed to stay in a stable. Of the many evils committed by the kid throughout the book, an instance that stood out as a point where the kid did not desire violence came when the kid was given the task of killing a Mexican man, but decides not to. Instead, the kid crossed to where the horse stood waiting and took the pistol and stuck it in his belt, and hung the canteen over the saddle horn, and mounted up and looked back at the wounded man. Then he rode out. This scene shows a shift in character with the kid, who, despite being characterized earlier as constantly seeking out violence, decided not to kill the already dying man. This rhetoric is extremely important at pointing out the kid's growing morality, as well as serving to show the power over life an observer who doesn't act has. This brings further into question the problem of evil, however this time seemingly flipping the scripts on the problem, questioning why a malevolent God doesn't kill us all. One of the most prominent and direct opinions of the problem of evil given by McCarthy comes from the scene of the kid finding a burning bush in the desert, which is described as, "The tree was a lone tree burning on the desert, a heraldic tree that the passing storm had left." The kid would then go on to rest by the tree and wake up in the morning. This scene is extremely important at exposing McCarthy's personal opinion on the problem of evil, as the scene greatly parallels the story of Moses and the burning tree, which God spoke to him through. Very important in McCarthy's scene, however, is the omission of the tree speaking to the kid, which implies there is no God in McCarthy's world. The scene ends with the kid and the rest of the remaining members of the Glanton gang holding up in a stable that is described as, "The stable smelled of clay and straw and manure, and in the soiled yellow light of the lamp their breath rolled, smoking through the air." This scene serves to parallel the Bible story of Jesus' birth within the stable. However, McCarthy intentionally describes the poor and disgusting conditions of the stable to juxtapose the two scenes of Jesus' birth and the Glanton gang's arrest. This acts to force the reader to question how the conditions truly are in a world apparent in front of them. The final and most prominent instance of the problem of evil occurs within the falling action of the Great Gatsby. In Chapter 8, the beginning of this scene follows Nick as he considers the events which led to Myrtle's death. Nick meets up with Gatsby and discusses the affection Gatsby once had for Daisy. However, they are interrupted by the pool cleaner asking if Gatsby wants to drain the pool. Gatsby directs the pool cleaner not to and decides to swim once Nick leaves. The scene then shifts its perspective to Wilson, who is becoming extremely focused on the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg, which he believes to be the eyes of God. Wilson then recalls his conversation with Tom about the man driving the car, and he travels to Gatsby's residence, where Wilson then shoots Gatsby, then himself. The scene then shifts back to Nick, who returns to Gatsby's house to find Gatsby dead, floating in a pool. Throughout this scene, a major focus is on the words, actions, and beliefs of Wilson. Wilson's conversation with the coffee shop owner, Nicholas, reveals Wilson's growing religious discontent, especially seen when Nicholas says, "Didn't you get married in a church?" And Wilson responds, "That was a long time ago." This dialogue serves to demonstrate how Wilson has grown distant from his beliefs, largely due to the evil he has witnessed, not only through the discovery of his wife's affair, but also through witnessing her death. This serves as a way for Fitzgerald to explain why people grow discontent with their religion and forces the reader to ponder why they believe what they do. Wilson's growing discontent with his beliefs, however, does not prevent him from using those beliefs to try and justify his actions of revenge, which can best be seen when he looks up upon the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg and he says, "God sees everything." This scene serves to critique the immoral actions people justify using the name of God. This forces the reader to look upon their immoral actions and ponder how they justify them. The final and most impactful rhetoric from this scene is the death of J. Gatsby, which was described as, "Gatsby must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass." The death of J. Gatsby itself serves to illustrate the death of the American dream within the mind of Fitzgerald, but also serves to illustrate how under the eyes of God, vile actions still occur. This is Fitzgerald's final argument on the problem of evil within the Great Gatsby, and it leaves the reader with a confrontation against their beliefs. The final confrontation of the problem of evil within Blood Meridian occurs in the following action within the 23rd chapter. This scene follows the kid, who is now called the Man, years after surviving the slaughter of the rest of the Glanton gang by the Yumas and surviving the chase of the judge. The Man is attempting to travel to Fort Griffin, but is confronted by a 15-year-old boy who mirrors the kid at the start of the book. The Man convinces the boy to leave, but later at night the Man is confronted by the boy again. The Man kills the boy and continues his journey in the morning. When the Man reaches Fort Griffin, he travels to a saloon and notices the judge sitting at one of the tables. The judge and the Man have a conversation about the Man and himself being the only survivors of the Glanton gang. The Man then ends his conversation with the judge and orders a prostitute. After the Man finishes his interaction with the prostitute, he leaves the saloon to go to an outhouse. The Man opens the door to the outhouse to find the judge waiting for him. The judge then grabs the Man and closes the outhouse door. The scene then shifts to people witnessing the aftermath of what occurred within the outhouse. Importantly, the actual aftermath is left undescribed and ultimately unknown. The scene ends with Judge Holden dancing atop the table within the saloon. One of the first pieces of rhetoric relevant to the problem of evil that occurs within this scene is the Man's first sight of the judge, who throughout the book has been proven to be a man who has committed acts far beyond regular evil. The Man's sight of him was described as, "Watching the Man across the layered smoke in the yellow light was the judge." This eerie description of the judge watching over the Man, ever before the Man saw the judge, serves as a parallel between an all-seeing God and the judge. This serves to imply that one of the interpretations of the judge is a malevolent God of McCarthy's world. This serves as McCarthy confronting the reader with the idea that, what if there is a God that's the opposite of benevolent? The scene then shifts to a conversation between the Man and the judge, where the judge questions the Man on fate and existence. One of the highlights of this scene occurs when the judge questions why a man might believe that there is no power and no force and no cause. And then he questions why one might believe that gods of vengeance and of compassion alike lie sleeping in their crypt and whether our cries for an accounting or for the destruction of ledgers altogether, they must evoke only the same silence, and that it is this silence which will prevail. This conversation between the judge and the man serves to provide an argument for an agnostic view of the world and critiques both the idea of believing that there is no creator and the idea that there is a creator who refuses to help his creations. This is effectively McCarthy making an argument for the belief that a God without reason is what created everything. The man leaves the saloon after a while and heads for an outhouse. In this outhouse, the scene the man discovered when he opens the door is described as the judge who was seated upon the closet. He was naked, and he rose up smiling and gathered the man in his arms against immense and terrible flesh, and shut the wooden bar latch home behind him. This scene describes the man's fate, and after this, the scene is left largely undescribed. This serves the purpose of cementing the judge's beliefs by killing all those who ever opposed him. This ultimately confirms the belief that McCarthy is making an argument for an agnostic belief. The final and most impactful rhetoric of the book occurs within its own paragraph as a description of the judge, and it says, "And they are dancing, the board floor slamming under the jackboots, and the fiddlers grinning hideously over their canted pieces. Towering over them all is the judge, and he is naked, dancing, his small feet lively and quick, and now in double time, and bowing to the ladies, huge and pale and hairless, like an enormous infant. He never sleeps, he says. He says he'll never die. He bows to the fiddlers and sashays backwards and throws back his head and laughs deep in his throat. And he is a great favorite, the judge. He wafts his hat, and the lunar dome of his skull passes palely under the lamps, and he swings about and takes possession of one of the fiddles. And he perutes and makes a pass, 2 passes, dancing and fiddling at once. His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says that he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. He never sleeps, the judge. He is dancing, dancing. He says that he will never die." This very long description of the judge and his actions serves to show the extent of the judge's existence. This description heavily mirrors some depictions of the devil. However, combining the clear lack of the presence from a benevolent God prompts the idea that in the world of Blood Meridian, the judge is God. Both F.ScottFitzgerald and Cormac McCarthy heavily explored the themes of the problem of evil throughout their works, The Great Gatsby and Blood Meridian. Throughout The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald repeatedly uses the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg as an allusion to a god overlooking the immoral land in front of him, and not acting. However, it is through the intentional uncertainness of the true interpretation of the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg that Fitzgerald makes his argument that either there is no God, or there is a God who witnesses immorality but does not act. This argument is heavily mirrored throughout Blood Meridian, where McCarthy uses the judge's philosophy throughout the book to argue that it is unfounded to believe that there is no creator, while it is also unfounded to believe that there is a creator who wants to act and can, but refuses to. The interpretation of both authors' reasoning is furthered when looking at a statement from the academic journal God, Gluts, and Evil that describes the line of reasoning that both authors follow. The article describes 2 of the common lines of reasoning, either the rejection of an existence of a God, or that God is only 2 out of omnipotent, omniscient, or omnibenevolent. Both Fitzgerald and McCarthy used themes of immorality to argue that either there is no God, or there is a God who refuses to act, thus demonstrating their answers to the problem of evil.